What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my first impressions for Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, which obviously bears a little bit of explanation, but it is one of the games I am excited for and planning to review this year, so getting an early look at it was obviously pretty nice, but as we are roughly a month or so ahead of the game's full release on February 4th, this is clearly coming a little bit early, and that is because the game's publisher, PlayOn through their publishing label Deep Silver, reached out and asked if I wanted to take a look at it, and obviously I said yes to that, which is how I'm bringing you this impressions video from the beginning portion of the game. Now, before we dive fully into those impressions, I do want to mention a couple of things. For starters, while I'm going to do my best to avoid spoilers here, and I'm not really covering anything story-wise that wasn't already mentioned in some of the promotional material, it is basically impossible to talk about this game without spoiling the first game at the very least, because it is a direct sequel, with this game beginning pretty much right after the first one ends. But with that out of the way, let's dive into this and talk about my first impressions for this game, which starts pretty much as always with how the game was running. I did play this natively on my own PC, and happy to report that so far it's been pretty good. Like, obviously I don't know how that's gonna hold up over the entirety of the game yet, but here in the early portion I haven't really had any issues. Just a couple of minor graphical things like clipping and stuff, but that's been it. And that's noteworthy because we are still quite a ways out from the actual release, and there will inevitably be a day one patch as an example. But even now, not really experiencing any problems. And I know with how the first game launched, that's probably a question on people's minds, so far that looks pretty promising. Now, in terms of the rest of the game, I will say that it pretty much seems to be what I wanted it to be, which was a refined version of the first game with less jank that was a bit easier to play as a result. Not so much in terms of difficulty, mind you, just, a little more intuitive and polished, while retaining the core of what made that game so interesting. And as I mentioned, so far they seem to be very successful at that. But here in the early parts of the game, I haven't gotten to experience too much of the new stuff in particular, like the guns that I know are coming up later that they've shown off, and of course, any more of the interesting quests that explore the daily life of people in Bohemia. Which brings us to a little bit about the narrative and stuff. Again, I don't want to go really into too much spoiler territory outside of basically what is already known, but still be mindful of that, maybe skip ahead if you don't want to hear any of it. But for those who are just completely unaware, this game takes place in 15th century Bohemia, during a time of political unrest that is loosely based on history. Some of this stuff actually happened, some of it is obviously embellished, things like that. But for the most part, the story is actually decently grounded in reality. And to that end, the original game ends with our character, Henry, and his friend, a nobleman named Hans, going off to a place called Trotsky Castle to deliver a message about the resistance who is fighting the current King Sigismund, who has imprisoned his brother, the rightful ruler. And obviously, things don't go exactly according to plan there, and thus we have a big grand narrative to explore, involving both the Silver Conspiracy from the original game as a simple example. But big picture, our goal is basically to put a stop to King Sigismund, who is ultimately the person, or at least one of the people, behind the raid on Henry's home, our protagonist here, which saw the death of his parents, who he is trying to avenge. And that somewhat brings us to the various progression systems and how those have been iterated upon, but the other part of that is how that ties into the story, because if you've played Kingdom Come Deliverance 1, while you start that game an almost generic medieval peasant, you can slowly, through hard work and determination, become a genuinely fearsome warrior that would be extremely difficult to kill and would be very overpowered at the beginning of this adventure. So how do they, of course, bring that down to earth and give you some progress and things to be achieved? Well, I think it's handled pretty well. I obviously don't want to say exactly how, but I will say that your character gets injured, and as a result of that, you have to sort of get yourself back into the swing of things as you overcome that injury. Now, with that in mind, even then, your Henry in this game starts off in a much better place than the Henry from the original game. In particular, though, a lot of your skills will start at 5 or above. Now, that might not sound like anything meaningful, but it's important because in the original game, the space of using a skill from like level 1 to 5 of it was generally accompanied by like a penalty of some sort. So as an example, an easy one, if you were using a bow before that level, you had to use a special arm guard or you would actually injure yourself from the bowstring hitting your arm. But after level 5, you didn't have to worry about it. So as an example here, because we're starting at that increased level, we don't have to worry about some of those penalties straight out of the way, which should make things a little bit easier for most people, I imagine, while also making narrative sense in the context of this, which I appreciated. But otherwise, the progression systems are largely the same as you remember if you've played the original. We have our main level, which is then divided up into several different attributes, and various skills, both non-combat and combat related. As we participate in any of these activities, we gain experience for them and level them up, which all collectively contributes to our main level. Both our main level, our attributes, and our various skills will reward us with various perks as we level them up. This is going to make all of these things easier, like the frequency that you have to eat and drink, how quickly things will rot in your inventory, as there are some sort of survival-esque mechanics here, but a lot of that can be mitigated if you know how, like for instance going to a drying rack. But that actually brings me to another point about progression and the gameplay overall. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 here does a much better job of tutorializing the player than the original does, in a way that at the same time still feels very relevant to the way the narrative plays out. So this means things like the game's pretty in-depth alchemy system that is really cool gets properly explained and broken down piece by piece to new characters, and that one is especially important because it's probably the easiest way to get your hands on the Savior Schnapps. This is an in-game item that you need in order to make a manual save outside of just sleeping or, exiting the game. And I will say that perhaps that's just my experience with the first game, but that seems to be much less of a nuisance here overall. Not only do they do a better job of explaining the system of how to get them generally, but they also seem to just be more widely available from shops and things. So while it was a bit of a pain point, and I still don't really love that system overall, it is nonetheless a bit easier to manage here without at the same time gutting it entirely, which hopefully other people will wind up feeling the same way about, but I was pleasantly surprised by that myself. But other systems they do a great job of explaining are, for instance, the game's persuasion system and its various mechanics. So as you participate in the gameplay, your clothes can get dirty, they can get covered in blood, people will comment on this, and you'll have to, ideally, wash that stuff off and take care of yourself. And this determines how people see you in addition to things like reputation. And it is all of those things together that combine to make your success chance at a given persuasion check. So you have the base skill for that thing, based on things like your speech and your perks, but then it's also how much the person you're talking to generally likes you in addition to what you look like. For instance, if you're trying to pass yourself off as a noble but are in fact dressed like a dirty peasant, they're not going to believe you. And while that system was largely in place in the original, it does feel a bit better here as well. It's one of those things that there's a lot of subtle improvements on while retaining the core of it. And that kind of goes hand in hand with the game's really layered armor system, which I've always appreciated. And that also actually has things like colors even that you have to be aware of. So you can get a lot of the same types of armor in various tiers but in different colors. And that matters because it affects stats like your overall visibility. So if you want to be a stealthy character, you actually want to wear basically quiet, dark clothes, which means excluding things like armor that really increases your noise stat or your visibility. So you can sneak in and ideally, perhaps take out enemies stealthily if that's the playstyle you're wanting to go for. But all of these systems combine to make all of the playstyles that you would probably see from the original. But what I'm really curious about myself is things I didn't get to experience in this preview, which again is like where guns and things like that fit into the whole picture. But overall, again, just feels like a really refined version of the first game, which can also largely be said of combat. Again, mostly the same system here, but a few refinements that make it a bit easier. So they, as an example, trimmed down the part system. So basically when you're in combat, you'll aim your weapon in a given direction, which is where you'll be swinging from. And you can string these together later on to make combos once you get Henry back up to speed, is my understanding. And while this particular system, I think, was a little contentious for a lot of people, in this instance, I think it is, again, much better because they do a good job of tutorializing it this time around, as opposed to some of the mechanics being hidden behind a sort of second tutorial later on in the game that they don't do a great job of telegraphing. Here, both from Henry being in a better starting position on top of, again, a better tutorial overall, it's a little easier to manage, and I think it'll be easier for people to get into it, though I imagine, due to its overall nature of being just the same as the original in large part, it still might likely be a contentious one. But the game does explain how to perform your perfect blocks, your ripostes, and various things like that. And because of the way this system works, taking on one person is pretty straightforward, provided you have the skills to actually do so, because their ability to break through your defenses and you theirs is going to come down to your skill in individual weapons and things. So it is still a decent amount actually skill-based mixed with the stats of our character, Henry, but again, you start off in a better place here. And while I haven't messed around, obviously, with things like the guns, like I mentioned, the rest of it feels a lot better more generally, but a lot of the same principles apply. So, for example, if you keep your stamina high, you'll take less damage, and that's important in combination with your armor because your current health will degrade your maximum stamina stamina, and you need stamina, of course, to swing back and fight enemies, and this is another area where perks and things in combat skills will help you mitigate a lot of that, letting you go farther with the same amount of stamina, for instance, and things of that nature. And that is why it's so important for Henry to do things like sleep, eat, and take general care of himself while pursuing this choice and consequence-laden world. So, as a first impressions video, I am impressed with what I've seen here so far. It seems to be exactly what I was looking for, which was the first game but more refined, and I think as long as this game manages to hold that up and make an interesting narrative that reaches a satisfying conclusion in this game, then I think it will definitely surpass the original, and that was a game I already enjoyed. So thus far it's looking pretty good, but obviously we'll have to wait for the full review at another time, so that's where we're going to leave this particular video. So I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.